the clash of political cultures between the colonists and the English or the British. First off, let's take a look at the English Constitution. We need some background. In the 1700s, Britain's Constitution is universally admired by political philosophers. People during the Enlightenment, people who thought about government, thought that England had the ideal constitution. But you can see it's in quotations up there because the English Constitution, unlike our own, is not one specific document. It's in fact a collection of documents and court decisions that together make up the rules for how the English government is run. Now, the U.S. Constitution separates the powers in our government into three branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The English Constitution is also respected for doing something similar, separating power between royalty, the king, between the nobles, the wealthy landowners in the House of Lords, and the common people who are supposed to be represented by the House of Commons. The reason we do this, the reason England does this, is to check power. We don't want one group or one body in government to have too much say. But let's get to the reality of British politics in the 1700s. One of the first realities, one of the first problems with this ideal is that men elected to the House of Commons are really coming from the same socioeconomic class as the House of Lords. They are rich, wealthy landowners who just don't happen to have a seat in the House of Lords. So they have enough money to get themselves elected into the House of Commons, which means you've got a bunch of rich, wealthy landowners in the House of Lords and a bunch of rich, wealthy men in the House of Commons. So nobody is really thinking about the common people. Nobody is thinking about the middle class or the poor. You also have the king forming what were called parliamentary associations. These are blatantly bribed members of the House of Commons who have agreed to support the king's policies. They might be given a job, they might be given land, they might be given something of value in exchange for supporting the policies that the king wants to see enacted. Another troubling reality of British politics at this time is that in 1715, only 20% of adult males in England had the right to vote. To say nothing of the fact that no women could vote, only 20% of the adult males, 1 in 5, owned enough property and met the other requirements that allowed them to actually vote. And still, another problem of the British political system at this time were what were known as rotten boroughs. England was divided into different boroughs. Think of these as voting districts. The problem was that people had moved, especially as a result of the agricultural revolution and emerging towns and cities. People had left the farmland and moved to cities. But the districts were never redrawn. So what you have is very unequal representation. You might have only a few hundred in one district and thousands of people in another district, but each one would have one representative in the House of Commons. What that means is that somebody who lives in that really populated district has less of a voice than somebody who lives in that less populated district. It also creates some problems because some of these boroughs are so small in population that it's really easy to bribe your way to gain enough influence in that borough to get elected. You only got to bribe half the people, or you only have to get half of the people to vote for you. So there's so few people in some of these boroughs that you only need to bribe a handful of people to have enough votes to win that seat in Parliament. Let's talk next about governing the colonies. Many people thought that the colonies would be governed similar to the way England was run. They thought that power would be divided just like it was in England. The governor would be kind of like the king. The governor's council, this group appointed by the governor, would kind of act like the House of Lords, and that the colonial assemblies would serve the same function as the House of Commons. This turns out to be entirely false. It's not true. Let's start with the governors. By 1750, most of the colonies had royal governors that are appointed by the king. And this position did not attract the best politicians. Becoming governor in an American colony is not seen as a desirable position that a young up-and-comer talented politician would try to go after. Most of the governors are former army officers who are taking this just for the paycheck. It's like going into pseudo-retirement. And as a result, they're not trying to make improvements. They're not trying to make a name for themselves. They're not trying to make the colonies better. They're in fact content to just maintain the status quo, keep things as they are, prevent any major problems. Despite their ineptitude, despite the fact that you don't really have talented people in the governor position, they had a lot of power. The position was given the power to veto legislation approved by the assemblies. In other words, the assembly could say, we think there ought to be a law, and the governor could say, nope. The governor is given the power to dismiss judges. So a judge that's elected by the people of the colony could be fired by the governor. And the governor is also given that commander-in-chief power. He commands the military and decides what they do and don't do. Let's move on to the governor's council. These are selected by England and the governor. And really, they're not popular from the beginning, and they are declining in power by the 1700s. They're really full of yes men by the 1700s, people that the governor is putting in place that will agree with him. Let's talk about the colonial assemblies. Compared to Britain, there's a lot more voters. These are a better representation of the people's will. 75% of white males are able to vote, not because of different laws, but because over here, land is really cheap. Also, you don't have districts, you don't have those rotten boroughs like they had in England. You don't have districts where a large number of people have left. So there's no districts where it's easy to bribe your way to victory. In fact, the colonial assemblies do a good job of creating new districts as the colonies continue to expand west. However, it's not a perfect democracy. Colonists would come out to vote on major issues, but they mostly let their representatives make the big decisions. And let's not forget, non-white people, Native Americans, African Americans, are not given the right to vote, and women are not given the right to vote. Now, we'll talk more about the wars between Britain and France later, but what we need to know for now is that a series of wars between Britain and France meant that more money was needed. And new money in the form of taxes collected from the colonists need to be approved by the colonial assemblies. This meant that the assemblies became more vigilant, they became more professional, and they became more important in the 1700s as more and more of these tax laws start being proposed. And they're finding that they have very little reason to support the policies of a royally appointed governor. They protested when the governors tried to bribe members of the assemblies, like the king had been doing with Parliament, because the colonists, maybe more so than Englishmen, truly believed in that separation of powers. We have weekly journals published in the colonies, in New York and Massachusetts especially, that are urging Americans to not tolerate political corruption. And most of the assembly members were lawyers. Now, one of the things the English did early on was standardize the laws throughout the colonies. In other words, Massachusetts had the same basic laws as South Carolina. What that meant was that lawyers across the country had similar complaints and experiences. And many of those lawyers serve in their colonial assemblies. So the members of the colonial assemblies have had similar experiences throughout the colonies. And that means when they start to work together, when they start to come together with the Albany Plan and with the Continental Congresses, there's already an underlying bond because they've had these similar challenges with English law.